Hey there everyone. Today we're going to learn how to actually get things to move around on a web page. Let's get started. Hey there everyone. Today we're going to focus on a new skill that incorporates what we learned in the previous episode with CSS animation and have it relate specifically to the category known as CSS Transforms. With CSS Transforms, we get to transform an element in a manner that is specific to 2D and 3D transformations. This means that we'll specifically get to mess with three forms of modifying an element in HTML. These three things will include the translation of size, so translation of space, so moving left or right, up and down, the skewing of an element, so changing the coordinates in which the corners are defined in, and finally, moving the object around in 3D space, so a 3D transform. So with those three things, let's go ahead and jump into how to get a transform to happen in the first place. To start off, what I'd like to do is highlight the setup we'll have for today's episode. To begin, it will actually be a continuation of the setup in the previous episode. So simply an H1 with an ID of whatever you'd like to call, and an emoji inside. The emoji works great because it scales at a relatively nice resolution. You don't have to worry about linking an image, and you get a pretty decent visual representation, and you can have something fun to play around with. Below our HTML, we'll have our CSS, where we'll call that ID, give the animation name, the animation duration, iteration count, and delay, whatever specifications you want to place into your animation, and alongside that, just scale up the size a little bit to make things a lot more visible. And with the animation name is, of course, the animation. But to begin, what I'll actually do is go ahead and clear this out, move this middle option so that we can just have a straightforward from point A to point B transition happen. Now that we have our setup out of the way, let's go ahead and actually learn how to have a transform happen within our CSS. And like most of the things we've run into within the world of CSS, things kind of name themselves. So today our CSS property that we're going to be changing is going to be transform. Not transform, but transform, followed by a colon, and then we'll actually go ahead and focus on that first type of translation and or movement that I was talking about when I discussed the three types of transforms that you can really do. Now, the first actually has two different versions, because you'll find that you can move things up and down, but you can also spin them around. It stays within the same space, but you're still translating something on an XY axis. So to begin, I'm going to actually start with the translate, and then we'll go into rotation. But to get started with the translation, what we'll do is specify which type of translation we want to do. So to begin, I'm going to try and move my emoji to the right of my screen. And in order to do so, I'll go ahead and write translate X as my property value. Now, what's different from this property value and most property values is that instead of entering in a variable like so, we've already actually defined the property, and the rule is the property value. So to give this a variable, what we'll have to do is place some parentheses right afterwards. With this, I'll go ahead and set it to 0 pixels because we don't want it to start at a different position. And then I'll go ahead and copy this section of my code, repaste it in at the 100% mark, and add a 50 beforehand. With this, we'll have our animation trigger and translate our emoji to the right 500 pixels. Like that, we have a translation on the x-axis, and a y-axis translation can be as simple as so. with that, let's go ahead and transition over into rotate. Now, even though the rotate and translate properties or property values are similar in terms of how they work at a programming level, what you'll find is that we actually have to use a different rule in order to rotate our elements. So instead of pixels, with rotations, it's a lot easier and a lot more logical to measure things in degrees, at least at the user's end. So in order to get our rotation to actually happen, what I'll do is change my pixels to degrees. The notation within CSS will be DEG, which is just a shortened version of degrees, and though it doesn't really stand for anything. And just like with any circle, we have 360 degrees to work with. So what I'll do is flip the emoji man upside down by doing a rotation of 180 degrees. And with that, we have our man flipping over something, and ideally I'd like to maybe place a cactus right there underneath or between where he is. Now, the reason this happened like this is because we've defined an area, and due to the fact that it's rotating in this fashion, it will rotate within the area that it has specified. So when you're messing with rotation, make sure to keep this issue that you could run into in mind. Now, just as a side note, something you can do to dictate where the axis of the spin is for your emoji or element or whatever you're rotating within your CSS is to define an origin point. So to be specific, what we'll have to do is specify a rule of transform origin and dictate which corner or where in the box we want this transform origin to come from. So here, now that I've changed it to bottom left, we find that instead of this arcing motion around the center, we'll be rotating around the bottom left portion of the elements box. So with that, let's go ahead and transition into skews. Now, skewing is actually a pretty simple process. Just like our other transforms, all we have to do is change the property value from rotate to skew. But what we'll actually find with skew is that it, just like the transform, or the translate, I should say, will be reliant on a system of an X and Y axis. So here we have a normal skew, which automatically sets to the X axis, but so just to be sure, not in there, just to be sure, we'll place the X to show that we'll get the exact same result. But if we'd like, we can also set it to Y. Before doing so, I'm gonna not make this skew as exaggerated, and now with our next playback, we'll see that we can just wiggle characters around, bend them around a little, and maybe if you have an image or a element comprised of multiple images, you can maybe animate a character, move some body parts around. Now, that would be a complicated project in itself, but a programming challenge if it's something you're looking for. So, just to test things out, we'll also show what a Y skew would look like. And like that, you'll see that it will skew our element at least 30 degrees upwards. And I'm sure if we gave it a negative value, it would go in the opposite direction, like so. So, with that, let's go ahead and transition into our final transform type that you'll find in CSS. Now, to show you the final part, the 3D transforms of CSS Transforms, what we'll find is that we've actually already learned the rules on how to modify these elements in a 3D space. All we have to do is add a third dimension. So far, we've used X and Y. And here, what you're currently seeing on the screen is actually still a use of Y, but I specifically chose not to show you the rotate Y and rotate X because I wanted you guys to understand the 2D transformations before the 3D. Now that we're here discussing the 3D, we can discuss that really all you need to create or manipulate an object in 3D will be those three axes. or axes if you prefer that way for some reason, but axi. And here you'll see that I'm rotating my emoji man 90 degrees at a y-axis. So, like this, my hand right here, you'll see that it will become a lot thinner at this profile than in the original one. And it's the exact same thing that's happening with our emoji man here. Alongside this, we can go ahead and rotate at a z-axis as well. The problem with this being that we don't really see what's happening in that third dimension with our 2D representation. However, when it comes down to it, you'll eventually find that when you start moving objects more than one direction, or moving certain directions and rotating certain ways at the same time, that you'll actually be able to modify these things and control all of these elements as if they were in a 3D space, which is separate from 3D libraries or 3D tooling that you can use to introduce actual 3D objects into the web, but those will be more related to JavaScript. So with this, I'd really like for you to go ahead, go past the emoji, find an image, find some text, play around and try using the web as a canvas for 3D and see what you can accomplish. I've seen people build actual towns. I've seen out of emojis. I've seen people build a forest scene. You can really do a lot with just this, a bit of layering, and a bit of a scene. So with that, next week we'll go ahead and transition into a bit more of the styling side of CSS, specifically relating to shadows, controlling of your borders, and the control of filters and or filtering images and elements directly through code in CSS. Until then, have a nice week.